Hey, folks. So, if you work in economic development for long enough, you start to notice a very specific, very funny kind of political whiplash. You will sit in a room with a governor or a regional mayor, and they will pound the table and say, "We believe in the free market. We need to cut red tape. We need to get the government out of the way so businesses can thrive. Laissez-faire." And then, in the exact same breath, without skipping a beat, they will turn to you and say, "Now, where are we with getting the state legislature to approve $500 million in taxpayer subsidies to build a custom highway interchange and a water treatment plant for this new mega factory?" We preach the gospel of the free market, but the reality of how we build economies is deeply, heavily managed by the state. We think this is a modern hypocrisy. Well, it isn't. Today, we are traveling to 19th century Britain, the absolute peak of the Industrial Revolution. We're going to take a look at the society that invented the concept of the free market, only to realize that a purely unregulated economy is a meat grinder. We are going to explore the great contradiction, how the Victorian government reluctantly built a massive administrative state to save capitalism from itself, while enthusiastically using the exact same state to discipline its poorest citizens. I'm your host, Devin Hillsdon-Smith, and you're listening to Site Selectors Are People Too. This is episode 5 of The Architects of Prosperity, the British model and the ambiguity of laissez-faire. So let's get into it. As we said, welcome back, everyone. Before we dive into the smog and steel of Victorian London, a quick word from today's sponsor, Hyphen Strategies. In economic development, it is incredibly easy to buy into your own marketing. We sell business-friendly climates and turnkey regulatory environments. But as we are about to learn today, true economic stability requires a delicate balance between market efficiency and social infrastructure. That's where Hyphen Strategies comes in. Hyphen Strategies is a premier advisory firm that helps communities and corporate leaders bridge the gap between bold vision and ground-level reality. Whether you're navigating a complex site selection matrix, evaluating the true cost of local labor dynamics, or trying to understand your region's actual comparative advantage, Hyphen gives you the clear-eyed, data-driven roadmap you need to close the deal. Stop buying into the myth of the perfect market and start building a foundation that lasts. Visit www.hyphenstrategiesllc.com to learn how we can help your team connect the dots. All right, let's head to the factories. In our last episode, we watched David Ricardo mathematically prove that free trade was the key to unlocking global wealth. And in 1846, Britain actually listened to him. They repealed the protectionist Corn Laws, threw open their ports, and committed their entire global empire to the ideology of free trade. To understand the world we are stepping into today, you have to understand the absolute swagger of mid-19th century Britain. By the 1850s, Britain was the undisputed, unrivaled economic superpower of the world. They were officially dubbed the workshop of the world. In 1851, they hosted the Great Exhibition in London, building a massive structure entirely out of iron and glass called the Crystal Palace, just to show off their industrial dominance to the rest of the planet. They were effectively the Silicon Valley of the 1850s, but instead of writing software, they were forging steel, weaving miles of textiles, and building the steamships that connected the globe. And the official religion of the New World was laissez-faire. The term laissez-faire was originally coined by the French physiocrats we talked about last episode. It translates roughly to let it be, or let them do. As an economic doctrine, it holds that the market is naturally self-governing. It assumes that if you just leave buyers and sellers alone, Adam Smith's invisible hand will sort everything out perfectly. Therefore, any state intervention, any safety regulation, any minimum wage, any tariff is not just unnecessary, it is actively destructive to wealth creation. For the new class of wealthy industrial factory owners, laissez-faire wasn't just a political talking point, it was the absolute gospel. They had just spent decades fighting the old aristocratic landlords to achieve free trade, and they won. They looked at their massive factories, their soaring profits, and the sprawling British Empire, and they thought, we cracked the code. The free market is perfect. The government just needs to get out of our way. But this absolute devotion to the free market created a massive philosophical problem when it came to poverty. You see, if the free market perfectly distributes wealth to the people who earn it, what does it mean if someone is starving in the street? Under strict laissez-faire logic, the market is never wrong. Therefore, if you are poor, it is not a systemic failure. It is a personal, moral failure. You are poor because you are lazy. You are poor because you lack discipline. And if the state intervenes to help you, the state is actually breaking the perfect machinery of the economy. But this wasn't just a vague moral judgment. This was backed up by what was considered at the time to be undeniable, cutting-edge science. To understand the terrifying logic of the Victorian state, we have to talk about a man named Thomas Robert Malthus. Thomas Malthus was an English cleric and an influential scholar. In 1798, he published a book called An Essay on the Principle of Population. And the math inside the book absolutely terrified the British elite. Malthus argued that human society was trapped in a permanent, inescapable cycle. He called it a biological law of nature. Here was his logic. First, he looked at food production. He noted that agricultural output grows arithmetically. What that means is it grows in a straight linear progression. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You clear a new acre of land, you get a little more wheat. It's slow and steady. But then he looked at human reproduction. Malthus argued that the human population does not grow arithmetically. I have to get that word right, arithmetically. It grows geometrically or exponentially. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. Because of the mathematical reality, Malthus said it is inevitable, an absolute mathematical certainty, that the human population will always eventually outgrow the food supply. You can call this the Malthusian trap. So I can say Malthusian correctly, but I can't say it arithmetically? Come on, Devin. We got this, folks. So, what happens when the population hits that ceiling? Malthus said nature steps in with what he calls positive checks. And by positive, he didn't mean good, he meant active. These positive checks were famine, disease, and war. According to Malthus, massive starvation events were not tragedies, they were nature's necessary mechanism for rebalancing the equation. Millions of people had to die so that the survivors would have enough food. Nice, Malthus. Now think about what this math means for government policy. Think about what this means if you're an elite politician sitting in Parliament looking out at the slums of London. Now, before Malthus, if you saw a starving family, the Christian, moral response was to give them a loaf of bread. But Malthus completely inverted that morality. Malthus argued that if you give a starving family a loaf of bread, you are actually committing a horrific crime, an act of cruelty against the future. Why? Because if you save that starving couple, they will survive long enough to have 4 children. And because the food supply hasn't actually grown, you now have 6 starving people instead of 2. Therefore, according to our cheery good fellow Malthus, the most moral, data-driven, economically sound policy a government could enact was to do absolutely nothing. Charity was murder. Poor relief was a trap. The best thing that government could do was let the weak die off quickly so the strong could survive. And this became the foundational ideology of the Victorian elite. They combined the free market gospel of Adam Smith with the terrifying demographic math of Thomas Malthus, and they decided that any state intervention to help the poor was economically ruinous and biologically disastrous. So, that was the theory. That was the pristine mathematical boardroom philosophy of laissez-faire. The market is perfect, the state should do nothing, and the poor must be left to harsh discipline of nature. But theory is easy when you're sitting in a quiet office reading a book. The moment the British politicians actually stepped out of Parliament and looked at the reality of the cities they had built, when they saw what an entirely unregulated market actually looked like on the ground, their pristine theories shattered into a million pieces. When we come back, we leave the boardroom and go on to the factory floor. The British government comes face to face with the Sadler Committee and realizes that pure capitalism might literally consume an entire generation of children. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Architects of Prosperity. Before the break, we talked about the pristine theoretical world of laissez-faire. The politicians and economists sitting in their quiet, comfortable London clubs had convinced themselves that the free market was a perfect machine and that government intervention was practically a sin. But then you step out of the club, you travel north to Manchester or Yorkshire, and you walk onto the factory floor. The reality of the early Industrial Revolution is hard for our modern brains to fully comprehend. These textile mills were massive, unventilated brick fortresses. Inside, the air was so thick with cotton dust that workers developed severe respiratory diseases within months. The noise was so deafening that operators had to develop a primitive form of sign language just to communicate. But the most glaring, undeniable humanitarian crisis was the labor force itself. The factory owners quickly realized that to maximize the efficiency of these massive machines, they didn't need strong adult men. They needed people who were small, nimble, easily intimidated, and cheap. They needed children. We aren't talking about teenagers working a summer job. We are talking about children as young as 6 or 7 years old. They were given a highly specific, incredibly dangerous job. Some were called piecers. Their job was to lean over the massive spinning mules and frantically tie together the cotton threads whenever they snapped. They were expected to do this while the machinery was still moving. Others were called scavengers. This was the most dangerous job of all. You see, a scavenger was a child small enough to physically crawl underneath the massive moving iron looms to sweep up the loose cotton dust and debris to prevent the friction of the machines from starting a fire. If the child misjudged the rhythm of the machine, they would be crushed. The hours were agonizing. Children regularly worked 12 to 14-hour shifts, 6 days a week, often beaten by overseers to keep them awake. Now, if you asked a factory owner about this, they would use the exact logic of Thomas Malthus that we just talked about. They would say, we are providing a free market solution. If we didn't employ these children, their families would starve. This is just the natural law of economics. But the British public was starting to wake up to the horror. Evangelical reformers and anti-slavery campaigners turned their eyes away from the colonies and looked at their own backyards. Men like Richard Ostler began publishing furious letters in the newspapers, explicitly comparing the treatment of British mill workers to colonial slavery. He called it Yorkshire slavery. The pressure mounted until the government was forced to do something it desperately hated doing. It had to investigate the free market. In 1832, a member of Parliament named Michael Sadler led a formal investigative committee. The Sadler Committee did something radical. They didn't just interview factory owners, they subpoenaed the workers themselves. They brought child laborers and medical doctors before the British Parliament. The testimonies were put into a massive public report, and the details shocked the conscience of the nation. Doctors testified about seeing a generation of children with severely stunted growth, curved spines, and permanently deformed legs from standing at the looms for 14 hours a day. Workers testified about losing fingers, hands, and arms in unshielded gears. The government realized it had to act. The human capital of the nation was literally being ground into dust. But because the politicians were so deeply obsessed with laissez-faire ideology, they tried to intervene without actually building a regulatory framework. The early legislative attempts are a masterclass in how not to regulate an industry. Years earlier, in 1802, they had passed the Health and Morals of Apprentices Act. The law essentially said, please treat the children a little better. It was a total failure. Why? Because it had absolutely no enforcement mechanism. To check on the factories, the law relied on visitors, usually local clergy or justices of the peace. And who were the justices of the peace? They were the factory owners' friends, peers, and drinking buddies. Unsurprisingly, no one was ever fired. In 1819, they tried again with the Cotton Mills Act, which officially banned children under the age of 9 from working in cotton mills. Again, it completely failed. The state passed a rule but refused to fund a structural mechanism to enforce it. The factory owners just ignored the law, and the state looked the other way. But after the Sadler Report of 1832, the public outcry was too loud to ignore. The dam finally broke. The following year, Parliament passed the 1933 Factory Act. This act was an absolute revolution. Not necessarily because of its rules, though the rules were important. It reaffirmed that kids under 9 couldn't work in textiles. It capped the workday for kids aged 9 to 13 at 9 hours. And it forced owners to provide the children with 2 hours of schooling every day. But the rules aren't what changed history. The 1833 Act was a revolution because it invented the modern technocratic state. The most critical feature of this law was the creation of a professional inspectorate of factories. You see, instead of relying on local volunteers or the honor system, the British government hired 4 full-time, highly paid inspectors to oversee the entire country. These 4 men reported directly to the Home Office in London. They were completely independent of the local political machines in Manchester or Leeds. They could walk into any factory at any time, unannounced. They could demand to see the age certificates of the workers. And most importantly, they had the legal power to bypass local judges and directly impose heavy financial penalties on the factory owners. This was a profound paradigm shift. This was the birth of the administrative state. It was the great-grandfather of OSHA, the EPA, and the SEC. The British government finally admitted that you cannot just pass a law, you have to build a bureaucracy capable of enforcing it. And once that bureaucratic dam broke, the regulations just kept coming. The 1844 Factory Act legally mandated that dangerous heavy machinery be physically fenced in to prevent amputations. Finally, the 1847 Act, known as the 10-Hour Bill, was passed, capping the workday for all women and teenagers at 10 hours. The industrial capitalists absolutely hated this. They fought it tooth and nail. They claimed that limiting the workday would destroy their profit margins and ruin the British economy. They screamed that it was a violation of laissez-faire. But the state had realized a fundamental truth. If it did not reluctantly step in to regulate capital, the free market would consume its own workforce. Capitalism had to be saved from itself by the interventionist state. So that is the reluctant face of Victorian government. They hated regulating business, but they were forced to do it to stop a humanitarian catastrophe. But if the government was hesitant to tell the rich what to do, they had absolutely zero hesitation when it came to telling the poor what to do. So when we come back, we explore the dark side of the great contradiction. The Victorian state enthusiastically builds a network of prisons for the poor. Be right back. Welcome back to the Architects of Prosperity. Before the break, we saw how the British government reluctantly abandoned pure laissez-faire to pass the Factory Acts. They stepped in, kicking and screaming, to stop a generation of children from being literally ground to death in the textile mills. But there was another side to this interventionist state, an enthusiastic, cruel, and highly ideological side. If the Factory Acts were about saving capitalism from itself, the law we are about to discuss was about using the heavy hand of the government to actively terrorize the working class. We have to talk about the New Poor Law of 1834. To understand this law, you have to understand the problem the government was trying to solve. For centuries, Britain had a localized welfare system. If a family was starving or a worker was injured, the local parish church would provide them with the basic food, clothing, or a small cash handout funded by local taxes. It was a localized safety net, sometimes called outdoor relief. But by the 1830s, the population was exploding, and the Industrial Revolution was disrupting traditional farming. Millions of people were pouring into the cities. The local tax burden to feed the poor was absolutely skyrocketing. The industrial elites and the classical economists were furious. They were heavily influenced by Thomas Malthus, the man we talked about in part 1, who argued that feeding the poor just creates more starving people. Malthus and his followers looked at the local welfare system and said, "This is a disaster. If you give starving people free food, you are violating the free market. You are subsidizing artificially low wages. More importantly, you are encouraging idleness." They believed that a safety net destroyed a worker's motivation to find a job. So, in 1834, the government intervened. They completely overhauled the welfare system, centralizing it under a brutal new set of rules designed by utilitarian reformers, most notably a man named Edwin Chadwick. That would be his name. The new poor law was built on two incredibly dark systemic principles. The first principle was the workhouse test. The government declared that absolutely no financial relief, no food, and no charity would be given to any able-bodied person outside of a state facility. The era of outdoor relief was over. If you were starving, the state would feed you, but only if you surrendered your freedom, left your home, and entered a massive government-run institution called a workhouse. The second principle is one of the most chilling concepts in economic history. It was a legal, bureaucratic doctrine called less eligibility. The doctrine of less eligibility legally mandated that the living conditions, the diet, and the labor inside the workhouse must be intentionally designed to be worse than the standard of living of the absolute poorest, lowest paid free labor outside the workhouse. Let me repeat that. The government legally required these facilities to be horrifying. If life inside the workhouse was even slightly comfortable, the economists argued, lazy people would just live there instead of working in the factories. Therefore, the workhouse had to be engineered as a place of psychological and physical torment. When a family entered the workhouse, they were immediately separated. Husbands were separated from wives. Children were stripped from their parents. They were issued rough, prison-style uniforms. They were forbidden from speaking to one another during meals. The food? Well, it was practically inedible. Mostly a watery gruel carefully calculated by government dietitians to provide exactly enough calories to keep a human heart beating, and not a single calorie more. And the inmates were forced to do agonizing, completely pointless manual labor. They weren't building roads or infrastructure. They were given tasks designed to break their spirits. A common job was oakum picking, forcing inmates to unpick old, tightly wound, tar-covered naval ropes by hand until their fingers bled and their nails cracked. But to truly grasp how the Victorian state was willing to push this laissez-faire ideology, we have to look at one specific institution, the Andover Workhouse. In 1845, rumors started leaking out of the Andover Workhouse in southern England. The facility was run by a former army sergeant named Colin McDougall. McDougall was a sadist, but he was also incredibly cheap. To save money and impress his superiors in London, McDougall was severely skimming the inmates' already meager rations. The inmates at Andover were literally starving to death. One of the labor tasks assigned to the men at Andover was bone crushing. The local farmers would drop off massive piles of animal bones, horses, dogs, sheep, and the inmates were forced to crush them into dust using heavy iron rams, so the dust could be sold back to the farmers as fertilizer. The inmates were so starved, so desperate for calories, that when the rotting animal bones arrived in the yard, they would physically fight each other for the freshest bones. They would crack them open and suck the putrid, rotting marrow out of the center just to survive. A local guardian finally blew the whistle, and the resulting scandal horrified the British public. Parliament was forced to launch an investigation, and the details of the Andover bone-crushing yard were plastered across every newspaper in the country. The Andover scandal perfectly illustrates the horrific logical endpoint of laissez-faire taken to its absolute extreme. The poor themselves completely understood what the government was doing. They accurately dubbed the new workhouses prisons for the poor. Now, think about the sheer, breathtaking hypocrisy of this economic model. The industrial elite used the language of the free market to argue against safety regulations in their factories. They told the government, you can't pass the factory acts, you can't limit the workday, that's state interference. But when it came to the labor supply, they enthusiastically used the massive, heavy hand of the state to build a network of localized prisons. They used taxpayer money to construct a system of terror, specifically designed to terrify the working class into accepting starvation wages on the unregulated factory floor. The workhouse wasn't a glitch in the Victorian economic system. It was the engine that drove it. When we come back, we wrap up the British model. We look at how this exact same ideological battle, the great contradiction between market efficiency and social infrastructure, is still the single biggest challenge you face as an economic developer today. See you in a sec. So, we arrive at the great contradiction of the British model. The 19th century liberal state claimed to worship the invisible hand of the free market. But in practice, they built a massive, unprecedented administrative machine. They were torn between two opposing forces, reluctantly accepting humanitarian regulations on capital to prevent their society from collapsing, while enthusiastically wielding the power of the state to force the poor into the unregulated labor market. Now, I know what you must be thinking. Devin, this is a fascinating history lesson, but I'm an economic developer in Texas. I'm a site selection consultant in Chicago. Why do I care about Victorian workhouses and 1830s factory inspectors? Because, my friends, we are still living inside that great contradiction. We are currently living through a technological shift every bit as disruptive as the steam engine and the power loom. And the exact same ideological battles that were fought in the British Parliament are being fought right now in city halls and state legislatures across the world. Let's look at the gig economy. Let's look at Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, and the massive tech platforms of the 21st century. When these companies first launched, they used the exact same ideological playbook as the 19th century textile barons. They essentially declared themselves exempt from traditional rules of the state. They said, we aren't a taxi company, we're a technology platform. We believe in laissez-faire. The market will regulate itself. Let buyers and sellers connect directly. And what happened? They generated unprecedented, world-altering wealth for their founders and their investors. They created massive efficiencies for the consumer. But look at the labor force. The platforms classified their workers not as employees, but as independent contractors. This was the modern equivalent of the Victorian factory owner saying, I don't force anyone to work here. It's a free contract. By classifying them as contractors, the companies stripped away the safety nets that the administrative state had spent a century building. Minimum wage, overtime pay, workers' compensation, and health insurance. For a decade, the state sat back and did nothing, completely mesmerized by the innovation and the wealth creation. The politicians wanted to be the workshop of the world for the digital age, so they are terrified to regulate capital. But eventually, the human cost became too glaring to ignore. Drivers were sleeping in their cars. Workers were putting in 80-hour weeks just to cover the cost of their gas and vehicle depreciation. The algorithms were acting as digital overseers, lowering piece rates dynamically without the workers' consent. So what did the state do? It reluctantly stepped in. Look at California's Assembly Bill 5, or the European Union's recent directives on platform workers. The government is trying to drag these digital factories back under the umbrella of the regulatory state. And just like the textile barons of 1833, the tech companies are fighting it tooth and nail, spending hundreds of millions of dollars on lobbying, claiming that regulation will destroy innovation and kill the economy. The battle hasn't changed. The only difference is that instead of a British factory inspector checking the physical fence around an iron loom, you have a modern Department of Labor investigator trying to audit a proprietary algorithm. And this dynamic, this tension, is the absolute core of the modern economic development industry. Think about the last time you received a massive request for proposals, an RFP, from a Fortune 500 company looking to build a new headquarters or an advanced manufacturing facility. What is the very first thing they demand in that RFP? They demand a business-friendly environment. They want massive corporate tax abatements. They want minimal regulatory friction. They want right-to-work laws. They want the modern, polished version of laissez-faire. But what is the second thing they demand? They demand a highly educated, highly specialized workforce. They demand robust, state-of-the-art public infrastructure. They want massive power grids, upgraded wastewater treatment plants, and perfectly paved highways. They demand top-tier public schools and beautiful public parks so their executives will actually want to live in your community. And they usually want the state to pay for a custom workforce training center right next to their factory. Do you see the great contradiction? They want the absolute freedom of the free market, but they require the massive interventionist state to socialize their risks, train their labor pool, and build their infrastructure. If a region leans too far into the laissez-faire myth, if you slash your taxes to absolute zero, defund your public schools, and ignore your infrastructure just to win a corporate headquarters, you end up hollowed out. You might win the ribbon-cutting ceremony, but 5 years later, the company will complain that they can't find any qualified engineers. The local power grid keeps failing, and the quality of life is too poor to retain top talent. Conversely, if a region regulates capital too aggressively and taxes businesses into oblivion without understanding the market dynamics, capital simply flees to a more accommodating jurisdiction. The Victorians learned the hard way that pure capitalism, left entirely to its own devices, will literally consume the society that sustains it. The modern technocratic state wasn't created by people trying to destroy the free market. It was created by capitalists who realized that a healthy, educated, stable society is the baseline requirement for a functioning economy. As economic developers, as site selectors, our job is not to blindly worship the free market, nor is it to endlessly expand the state. Our job is to manage the great contradiction. Our job is to find the exact right balance between market efficiency and social infrastructure that allows your specific region to thrive. You have to build the roads and train the workers, but you also have to let the innovators build. I'm Devin Hillsdon-Smith. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Architects of Prosperity on Site Selectors Are People Too. Join us next time as we finally leave the British Empire behind and look across the Atlantic. We are going to meet an American Treasury Secretary who looked at the British model, saw its flaws, and decided to write a completely different, radically interventionist playbook for global economic dominance. And remember, no matter how contradictory the policy gets, site selectors are people too. See ya. Just a heads up, views expressed in this podcast are solely my own and are not attributable to any employers, whether past or present. Thank you.